button. Today's speaker is Eve Wittenberg, who was one of my favorite collaborators, and I was trying to meditate early today how Eve and I connected. Of course, we have some colleagues in common, and we have done a study. Eve brought me in a study about pap smear and homeless women experience homelessness. But I think I had some connections earlier than that. But Eve is a researcher that is interested in a number of different aspects in decision sciences, but then is also very happy to kind of span out into new areas. With her colleagues, have gladly kind of taken research into to new dimensions. Spillover effects is one that comes to mind. Eve has demonstrated a capacity to have a solid commitment to make these things happen. There's some of the things that she's done has not been overnight successes, but have required real commitment. And I think the formatting of this FAMNet network, and I've had the opportunity to hear parts of this, and I've already benefited from some of the collaborations that Eve has in this network. But it's kind of demonstrative of the approach that Eve and her partners are taking to kind of like make committed change to the way that we think about things, but more importantly, the way we do things. So Eve, thank you so much for coming to our collaborative. As I mentioned, it's a group that talks about a range of different projects that focus on patient centricity, epidemiology, environment, causal mechanisms, and just so happy that you could come and present today.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I can't remember what the first overlap was. It was sometime before then. But yes, we've traveled in these sort of adjoining and overlapping and moving circles. And I appreciate that comment about persistence, because this has been as probably many people on the call know, doing work in the methods space is challenging. And I also find it really rewarding. So this is, in a way, a culmination of a few streams of research that have come together. So I want to tell you about this new Family Wellbeing Research Network, which we call FAMNet. And I also want to talk a little bit more broadly about why we're thinking about family well-being, what we're talking about, and actually make a pitch for the opportunities that are connected to the network. So absolutely feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I hope that this is interactive, and yes, John's comment about it being shared, part of what I will talk about is our online research resource repository. And my hope is to put a version of this symposium on that site. And I say a version because we are very expert in editing. So any side comments and all, we have an expert video person, and I'm really serious. We just snip all that stuff out. So everything I'm saying right now will be snipped out for the sanitized version. So don't worry if we have chatting parts of this. We just want to document some of the substantive information to share it more widely besides the people who are here. Okay, so that said, also if you have a question or comment, maybe let Anne know somehow, because I am very bad at looking at the chat in addition to everything else on the screen. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is titled Advancing Research on Emotional Well-Being, Introducing a Family Wellbeing Research Network. So the name of this research network that we coined, as I'm sure most of you know, it seems to be advantageous to coin some sort of name acronym in the whole grant submission process, and we're calling it FAMNet, Family Wellbeing Research Network. So we have funding from NICHD, which is the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. It is a U24 grant, which I just mentioned for a little education about different grant types. This is a cooperative agreement, which is a type of funding where the funding agency has an integral part in the actual project. So as opposed to a grant where the funds are given and you're on your own and there's basically trust that you will do the best thing. In this type of agreement, NIH actually has a scientific officer who is not like a principal investigator, but kind of on the same level. So it's a different sort of function, and it aligns with what NIH's goals are with this initiative, which I'll tell you about. So we started in June of last year, and it's a collaboration among the School of Public Health at Harvard, the University of Michigan, and the University of Pittsburgh. So there's 3 institutions involved in this. And this network is one of 6 networks that was established as part of this larger NIH initiative to advance the study of emotional well-being. So that's what their goal is. And they funded us as well as 5 others. And just to give you a sense of the scope of these networks that are focused on emotional well-being, there is one at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and the University of Tennessee, and most of these are collaborations across institutions. They're focusing on emotional well-being and economic burden. Another one at UConn is studying the mechanisms underlying mind-body interventions and the measurement of emotional well-being. So a lot of this emotional well-being field is focused on this mind-body interface and mindfulness and meditation. It really came out of that field. And I think this is pushing it more broadly. University of Wisconsin at Madison is studying the plasticity of well-being. So they're looking at human flourishing, which is another facet. And there are a couple other ones there that you can look through on your own. The one I would highlight, second to the bottom, is the Network for Emotional Wellbeing and Brain Aging. And there is a whole area of research on the neuroscience of well-being, which really just gives you a sense of the scope of approaches that different institutions are contemplating to look at this issue of emotional well-being. What we did is looked at family well-being, pretty much with the argument that we are taking an approach that considers how we're measuring this sort of outcome in a different unit of analysis. So I'm going to talk about that more, but at one point I will distinguish between emotional well-being, which is really the focus of this entire NIH initiative, and well-being, which is somewhat broader, but we get into a lot of the nitty-gritty and the semantics. That's part of the interesting part. In any case, so go ahead.
Sorry, one question that I had was, are all of these funded under a U24 mechanism, or are some designated? Sometimes in networks there you can use UH3, UG3 formats or UO1 formats, but are these all U24s? And then if they are, who serves as the coordinator of these, or how do these interact with one another?
Yeah, so it's an interesting structure. They're all U24s, and they are all U24s funded under one umbrella initiative that is funded by 3 institutes. So a National Institute of Aging, NICHD, ours, and NCCIH, which is Complementary and Integrative Health, something. And then like Office of the Director and some of the cross-institute things. So there's a whole NIH staff drawn from all of those institutes that serves as a coordination across the NIH side of it. There is a large steering committee that oversees the coordination across all 6 of the networks. And there is an intentional push to coordinate our work across all 6 of them. I mean, my guess was that there was a recognition that no one place would really capture everything that they wanted. So they intended to fund 5 or 6, whatever number, and pull them all together. Hence the cute little logo down in the bottom right, which is all 6 of them with their little individual logos all blended together. In any case, so NIH had what they call, this is a network of networks, a la what we were just talking about. Their goals, they state as follows, and they're really broad, and I think that they capture the diversity of the different networks. So they wanted to increase understanding of the fundamental constituents of emotional well-being, whatever that is, examine how the constituents at how they can act as potential intervention targets. So the goal is to consider emotional well-being as an outcome metric for use in health and all sorts of other things. To refine and implement science-based intervention strategies to enhance aspects of emotional well-being. And that's the focus on the mind-body stuff, what I call the UCSF, UC Berkeley stuff, because they're really that's where a lot of that came from. And also the Wisconsin people. There's some people who are really the leaders in that area of well-being, and also to develop measurement methodologies to scale up well-being interventions. And that's primarily where ours is focused, to consider how to measure some of these outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to transition and talk about FAMNet. So our goal, as we articulate, is to support and advance research on the measurement of family well-being and pediatric quality of life by funding new areas of study, supporting and mentoring the next generation of scholars, and providing education and resources for researchers. So there's 3 areas that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll come back to why we are looking both at family well-being and pediatric quality of life, partly from a grant writing perspective and partly from really what our goals are, because it's both of those. So I want to talk for a moment on why family well-being. And this goes back to a little bit of what John alluded to in the introduction. So when we were thinking about this, we were thinking of expanding the concepts that we had been thinking about in measuring outcomes in 2 different dimensions. So one is expanding the unit of analysis from an individual, which is what we traditionally and conventionally think of when we're thinking about quality of life outcomes, to the family. So thinking of that as a collective unit, and also recognizing that families generally contain people of all different ages. So that means we're thinking about children, adolescents, young adults, adults all across the stages of life, and older individuals. So in part, that's where the looking at pediatric quality of life comes in as well, because that area of measurement is less well developed than adult measures. And then also expanding in another dimension. So going from health-related quality of life or quality of life, which is what I and my colleagues have traditionally looked at in terms of outcomes, to this broader construct of well-being, and really trying to think about what the distinction is there and how to even look at those 2 constructs and how they differ, how to get from one to the other. So it's really a 2-way expansion of where the field has been and trying to move it forward in that way. So I want to talk a little bit about this expansion from an individual to the family. And this area of interest developed at least a decade, if not 15 years ago, with work that began in thinking about caregiving. So the initial work in expanding beyond the individual as a unit of analysis was recognizing that patients or people who have illness usually have somebody involved with them in some way. And that somebody, who is usually a caregiver, is also affected in some way by the fact that they are taking care of someone who is ill. So Anna Bobenak first was one of many who, in the initial stages of this field, wrote about 2 dimensions of this caregiving effect. And she described it as caring for someone and caring about someone. And she distinguished between these 2. And these are important to think about because both of them are elements that we want to capture in measuring the impact of illness on someone beyond the individual. So when we're thinking about caring for, this is traditional caregiving. And caregivers can be primary caregivers, secondary caregivers, or caregiving can be shared among people in a family and also beyond a family. And oftentimes, the research in the past has focused on caregiving for older adults in the context oftentimes of dementia or Alzheimer's. For children, there's been a lot of research on taking care of children who have mental illness, mental disorders, and severe disabilities, and also caregiving between spouses across all stages of life. And there has been a recognition that there are both positive and negative effects of caring for someone, of caregiving. And these span physical and emotional health, financial outcomes in terms of lost productivity, either deferred or reduced employment, social well-being, and also family dynamics, which is starting to hint at why we started to think about the broader aspects of family effects. So I'll just mention caring about, which is the other element that has been discussed in this field. And this applies to people who are not the caregivers. So they're all the other people in the family or the surrounding unit that still are affected by the occurrence of illness among one of the members, but they're not involved in actual caregiving. And these can be siblings who usually are not the caregivers of each other. They could be children of adults who have illness, who are usually not caregivers, adult children who might be distant from an older person who might not be directly involved in caregiving, and also the parent who in some cases is not the caregiving parent. So oftentimes there is a primary caregiving parent and then the other one. And usually caring about is manifested as negative effects of worry, stress, anxiety, the financial repercussions of family resources being depleted. This all is the stuff that impacts the people who are not the ones who are taking someone to appointment, doing daily caregiving activities, taking care of medications. This is the not caregiving stuff that also has an impact on people's quality of life and health-related quality of life, and I would argue well-being. Okay, any questions or comments?
Eve, you don't put a direct health effect there, such as what might be defined as the intergenerational effect. You know, do you care about your parents' health? Because we know that the parents' health can be connected to your health. For example, you know, substance abuse or other types of intergenerational effects like screening or other things like that that you could learn about the health status or genomic status or something like that. So I see the intangible costs are there and the indirect financial costs are there, but I'm interested why an intergenerational health effect is not there.
There absolutely could be. And Hadley will tell us all about this as an area of her study. You know, I don't think it's cut and dry about what should and should not be included. I think, as I'm sure maybe you would agree, we have traditionally separated between the, how can I say, like the actual health effects that have to do with genetic conditions or even infectious disease that has to do with being in a family and exposure, or we've really wrestled with substance use and alcohol use that is direct, that has a connection among both people are in proximity to one another and also actually within families because of predisposition to disease, and separated out this other stuff that is not that.
Mm-hmm.
For no real reason that I could explain. Perhaps because those things are easier to measure and more commonly measured, and this is more difficult to measure and less commonly included. So there's more of an emphasis or reason to focus on this, but I don't actually have a better explanation than that.
No, I think that's fine.
Okay. Okay, so if we are going to start thinking beyond even this landscape of caregiving and caring for and caring about and starting to think about the family as a whole, it brings up a lot of issues around measurement, some of which I just want to highlight here. So for starters, we need to think about who we are including in the family. And this is where we start getting into all of the nitty gritty kind of messiness of how complicated this is, and also why we are interested in this research network in focusing on family well-being, on the measurement part of family well-being. So for starters, we need to think about who is in the family, who is included and excluded, and also how that differs by context. So after a good amount of time and debate, we came up with the following definition. So I want to just go through this for a moment. And much of what I'm going to show you is actually on our website. And I'm also happy to share these slides if anybody's interested in the content here. So the way we define a primary family unit is as consisting of 2 or more individuals. And we actually discussed for a long time whether a family can be an individual, a single individual of one person, but we decided it needed to be 2 or more people whose relationship meets at least 2 of these criteria: shared financial responsibility, legal or blood relationship, and sharing a household residence. And I'll let you kind of think about those 3 for a moment and tell you that we scanned a lot of definitions of family, from everything from the UN to the Census Bureau to other international bodies that have struggled and grappled with this defining family for different sorts of reasons and contexts. And basically, our goal is to define a unit in which all the members have some sort of significant impact on each other and therefore shape the outcomes of all of those involved, because we are trying to understand what family is specifically in the context of measuring well-being. So these are things that affect, that define a group of people that impact one another in some way, because that was really what we were trying to get to. But in order to measure it, you do need to have some sort of working definition. And really our goal was to distinguish between friends, things like roommates, people who live together, in a group house, distinguish among all those and what we will call a family. Because most people, when we talk about family, they say they know what it means and they start to describe it and they use a lot of words, and we all have this sort of intuition about what group would and would not fall into a family. But to put it into language, this is what we came up with. And I'd actually be very interested if anybody has comments on these, because we caveated our entire definition by we may change our minds if we think differently over time. So if there's any comments, I can think of many. I can think of a number of examples that really are not completely captured by this definition. But we settled for what we thought would capture 80%.
I think I raised this maybe one time before when you presented this, but there are many indigenous communities for which this is a very restrictive definition, such as families that have more than one wife, but maybe not by law, but by relationships, or quite often where a so-called cousin might be the rearer of a child, even though it may not be a direct relative. And then also the other aspect of responsibility. So, for example, people who engage in a gang, for example, can quite often, well, maybe they might live in the same residence, but they might have sworn a blood oath or some other type of aspect, like a prison gang. But for example, we know some of the issues about health, such as infectious disease control or emotional well-being, could also apply in some of these potentially high-risk groups.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have I think that is all true. And I guess what it makes me think is that it might be valuable to at least articulate those they're not quite exceptions, but those other structures that either may meet some of these criteria or might be important for measuring well-being, but would not necessarily, well, that would or would not necessarily fall under this definition, but that are other structures or relationship structures that are of interest and are of importance. And even potentially articulating some of those, I think would add some clarity here. So I think that's useful.
So there, or they share a common household or economic unit or something like that, but that might be covered by the first one, such for example, as gang behavior may not fit into there, but the community, like an indigenous community may be defined in that financial. I might even think that that might need to be it. I'd want to think about that as financial or familial, but I hate tautologies.
Well, exactly. That's what we were getting. And you'll see some of the later definitions of well-being are well-being. It's explicitly written like that. You know, I think the other thing that was underlying this somewhat implicitly is a and I'm not sure we would put this in writing, but a family that we collectively in the US care about the outcomes of. And I don't know how to completely explain that, but we struggled a little bit with if we need to define family in a way that is sort of has face validity for policy reasons. And I guess, you know, when people don't care as much about the well-being of gangs. So even if they met this definition, I think we would exclude them from what we're calling family because there is an implicit, I think, thinking of the families that we want to worry about. And I am not saying I agree with this, but the families that we in the US from a policy perspective want to worry about.
I agree with you, but I also see that there's been some learnings from COVID about gang behavior, church behavior. Like some of the big mass outbreaks were associated by church communities who meet quite frequently together to pray together, and we as a unit found that that's where some of the big outbreaks were. So
Yeah.
I just wonder with infectious disease and also with opioid problems, you know, the group that shoots up together is also at risk, you know, for things like laced fentanyl, which we're having a problem with here in Ohio at the moment. You know, it is something that, you know, it is important tracer for some of these very high risk activities.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And excuse me for the barking just for 1 minute.
I thought that was John. No.
Well. My dogs are on the last
conference
call. Yeah. They've run downstairs.
Yeah. This issue of defining this, Eve, is really important because you have to have something that's countable, right? For doing research and for policy decisions. But it also strikes me as interesting because it basically indicates that this kind of family can be born and can die, right? So it doesn't have, it's not a static thing, it's a social entity, and it can be created, it can, you know, come apart. So people living in a commune, I guess by this definition, would probably be a family, right? Because they're probably cohabiting, they have an economic or social dependence. People in a cult, maybe not, you know, or a religious sect, I guess, probably not. To John's point, I mean, there are other kind of social units, right? That many of which are pretty fuzzy, right? So it's kind of hard to count them in a way that everybody's going to agree on. And I thought this was interesting. I myself actually have been in a family that would be defined by this, but has died, right? because dependencies and sharing a household residence came about and then went away with, members of the family passing and estrangement and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and yes, yes, I agree with you. So this is a dynamic construct that you're right. It exists within the confines of time, right? So can it exist? I'm sorry.
Okay.
1 minute. Out.
It's a misbehaving family member. Getting back to John, a question you were asking before about the secondary effects, it occurred to me that there are there can be social effects for family members, even when they're not the caregiver. Just sort of speaking from personal experience. Eva, I was just going back for a second about this idea of what are the sort of the secondary effects for people who are caring but not caregivers in a family. So just anecdotally, so I grew up in a household where my father had dementia and the family went bankrupt, and it actually had implications for kind of what my life was like, right? So not only was my mother very busy, this was, when people didn't talk about this very much, but it had significant implications on the kinds of activities I could engage in and how connected I was with friends. So there was kind of social disutility and all of that, aside from, kind of the struggling hand to mouth, sometimes only having beans to eat for a while. So those kinds of effects that can be pretty extreme, I think.
Yeah. And that's a lot of what we want to capture. So I think in a way, trying to, well, two things. One, we do have to come up with some sort of definition for the purposes of measurement. So, for better or worse, whether it captures everything, there has to be some common agreement just in order to get past this initial stage. And I am beginning to believe that we need to articulate these other structures that are probably adjacent to this definition that are also important. And by defining them, it will make this clearer because there will be fewer kind of exceptions to this. They will exist over here, and those will be the, for better or worse, sort of the commune, cult, gang. And I'm not putting these together, church groups. I'm just saying those other ones where the well-being is interrelated and they share some of these characteristics, and they are important for health outcomes, very important for health outcomes, and they're adjacent.
Well, there's some of them that are maybe even not adjacent. Such, for example, a ladder company in the fire department would use the term that they are a family, and they would cook for one another. They were so there's some things here that don't necessarily fall under your definition. A military unit in action would behave very much like a family. They would have a father figure. They would have a hierarchy. They would, and so maybe there is some maybe it's like the definition of what makes a religious group, that they have to have a codus, they have to have a hierarchy. There could be the way that you could, maybe that's what the approach that you're trying to do here. I'm not sure if these are and statements or statements when you're putting these. At least two. Okay.
Right, at least two. So yeah, so it would be both and or.
Well, what
So
happens
two
if
of them have to have an and?
What happens if they, one of the criteria was they explicitly identified as a family? And so, the fire department meets as a family, and they eat together, and they could be cohabitating at different points. That one, and even then they would have what they would classify as a blood relationship with one another, because they'd have a willingness to die for one another. Not Yeah, I think you're meaning
We're meaning genetic blood.
genetic blood rather than a blood oath, but
Not blood, right, in quotes. Well, but see, the thing is we would exclude that. So we're explicitly going away from self-defined as family with the reasoning that if someone who's interested in family well-being as an outcome measure, an insurer, some sort of payer, this has to sort of pass muster for, that's what I meant about like who we care about from a policy perspective. And the fire department group would not pass muster, neither would the gang, for when we're thinking about family well-being as an outcome. When I don't mean when we, you and me sitting here in this conversation, but when we societally in the US. Now, there's still solutions to that, right? So there will be people for whom a self-defined family, a halfway house, a 12-step group, that sort of group that defines themselves as family and really feels very strongly about the interconnection and the impact among one another and the shared outcome. But HHS is not going to care about them in the way that we're thinking of if we are extending health-related quality of life to family well-being in that context. So agree. But let me move on, because it's a really interesting conversation, but I want to talk a little bit about the constructs that go into this. So we start with this definition of family, and then we have to figure out what it is we're measuring in terms of outcomes. And I would suggest that there's two ways to think about it. You could combine individual level outcomes, or you could measure something that is unique and specific to a group of people that would be different than an individual outcome. And both of these have a number of implications. One is who responds or provides that data, and it also implies what is being measured. So the potential constructs range from health to health-related quality of life to well-being, which here's the example that I wanted to give of when people try to define what well-being is, they say it's well-being. And it is really, really difficult to define what well-being is. But the important thing is when people try to define family well-being, it has to do with how the individual members come together as a coherent unit or as a unit that exists distinctly from the individual members. Other things that have been floated are things like family functioning or cohesion, or this construct of family harmony, difficult to define, family level quality of life, and satisfaction. And so all the things that we talk about in individual level outcomes extrapolated to the family level. And the difference is when you talk about functioning, because that requires a set of people, an individual can function on their own, but this is something different. This is how individuals interact with one another. And going back for a moment to if we are going to think about a combination of individual level measures, we have to think about how to put them together. So we could add them up as a sum, we could take a mean. Both of these raise the questions of who is included and who is excluded. Do we weight everybody equally, or do we weight people differently? So for example, do we weight children more or less, or the same as adults? Every person, whether they are ill or not, it brings up a lot of questions. And it also brings up measurement questions of, do we use the same measure for all people or all individual members who are part of this family, or do we use different measures for different ages or different roles? So for example, do we use different measures for children and adults, for caregivers, not caregivers? It gets complicated fast, and there's a lot of questions that needs to be answered, hence our interest in looking at how to measure family well-being. If we're thinking instead about family level measures rather than individual level measures that we then combine in some way, similar questions arise, such as, do we use the same content for all families? Do we measure the same things in all families? Families with and without children, do we measure things differently for those two different ones, or is it the same construct across all families? Families that exist with just spouses or with spouses, not just spouses? What about families that are not necessarily within one residence? So if they meet the first two criteria and not the third criterion of being in the same physical residence. And then also the question of who responds or who provides the data, whether one person provides the data for the family or all members, how you deal with differences across people if you have multiple measures across members, and what to do with proxies. And can somebody in a family be a proxy for a family level assessment? So all of that sets the stage for why we're interested in looking at the measurement of family well-being in FAMNet. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on what we're doing, because there's one part I really want to talk about relevant, hopefully, to some people here. So our focus, as I mentioned, is on family well-being for people of all ages, given that family members can consist of people from childhood through very old age. We're focusing on measurement, and our goal is to catalyze research. So we're trying to push the field forward. That's the overall goal of this NIH initiative. And we're doing these three things. We're collecting research resources and making them available to people who are doing work in this space through a repository of different sorts of materials. We are providing research funding, and we're providing research mentoring through our research scholar core. So I primarily want to talk about our funding opportunities because I want to encourage people to apply for them. And that is part of my pitch. But very briefly, our web-based repository has three different components, none of which is complete yet, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but our intention is to catalog databases that are relevant for family well-being research and make them available. So to be a resource for where can I find data, secondary data that would be useful for this field of research. We are in the process of cataloging instruments that measure family well-being as that is defined by the field internationally, and that will be available in a searchable database, not ready yet. And we are going to provide videos that are germane to this field that would be useful. And for all of these things, we're also linking to the other 5 networks resources. So all of the networks, the mission and requirement across networks was to develop resources for research in whatever area they were focused on. So it's much broader than us, and our resources are also including linkages to all those other networks. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit, so just close your eyes for a second, because I want to talk about funding. So we are providing 2 types of funding, and this is part of all of the networks as well, in different sorts of formats. We are offering what we're calling pilot project grants, which are projects that lead to further work or research, hence the name pilot. They provide a maximum of $15,000 per award, any level of an investigator. Side by side with those are what we're calling our research scholar core, which are mentored projects that are focused on mentoring and developing that pipeline of researchers in this particular area. Those are a flat stipend of $6,000 for any sorts of expenses, with the caveat that it has to be acceptable to NIH, typical NIH requirements around costs under grants. And these are focused on junior faculty and below in order to really develop scholars in this area. I don't want to talk too much about the details of either of these. I would rather give you some examples of some projects that we have funded so far and areas that we're interested in. So everything is focused on measuring family well-being. So that would include, what do we mean by family? What do we mean by well-being? What do we mean by family well-being? And how do we measure all of those? And what those measurements are in different sorts of contexts, because the field is not at the point yet where we can actually measure family well-being. There's all these questions that I've raised to try to give you a sense of where we are as a field that we are seeking to advance the science of through some of this funding opportunities. And I would just reiterate that we're really looking across the lifespan, from children's quality of life through older adults' well-being, and how that all comes together as a family. So those are our pilot projects. Our research scholars are really to support and foster this pipeline of scholarship in this area. So we're really trying to bring more people into the field. The mentoring part of that is to help develop people, develop scholars in this area, develop investigators who are even working in this as just one aspect of their research or one part that fits into something else. And a lot of what we're doing with this, what we're calling the Scholar Corps, is developing networking among the scholars, between the scholars and our other grantees. We are trying to help foster careers of people who are involved in this Scholar Corps by giving them opportunities to present at our symposia, at conferences that we go to, by highlighting them on our website, by giving them publicity, visibility, and connecting them with our larger network. So we're really trying to advance careers of people whose research will touch upon this area, or people who actually want to focus on this area. So all of our grantees will participate in our network symposia, our activities. They get feedback from our investigators. So there's the three of us. We have co-investigators at all three of our networks who are somewhat, kind of in the background from the PIs, but are also involved and will become more involved as we get farther along with some of these grantee projects. And also, as I said, we'll give our grantees access to the resources that we have for translation and dissemination. Okay. I want to pause there and see if there are any questions about our funding opportunities, because this is something I really wanted to make a pitch for.
Eve, is there specific deadlines for these, or is this like a rolling opportunity?
There are specific deadlines. Let me jump to there. Okay. So we call them rolling applications, meaning that we accept applications at any time. They're not really rolling because, in point of fact, we're not reviewing them on a rolling basis. We're reviewing them on a 3-month basis. So it's not really true that they're rolling, but we're calling them rolling, and we review every 3 months and make decisions really within 2 weeks of receiving them, but then there's another 2 weeks of administrative bureaucracy before we actually get money out the door. So our schedule going forward is we will review everything that comes in by June 30th, September 30th, December 31st, and then on a 3-month cycle going forward until, I think, June of 2025. This is when the entire project concludes. And all the awards are for 12 months. And we have an official request for application that is on the website at that URL. And there's a lot more details. And, we've only been around for a year, so things are adapting a little bit as we go. So questions come up and we figure things out. We actually increased the amount for our awards as we realized that that would facilitate slightly more in-depth projects that we did have the budget to support. So things are adjusted as we go along because we're still in the early stages here.
Hey, Eve, can I ask a question about your pilot projects? I'm curious, is FemNet looking for or interested in kind of both conceptual work as well as in the field applied work? Or do you have a preference or leaning one way or the other?
Both, particularly conceptual work, because because we get less of that, or we have so far, including as inquiries. So we really want we really want to establish that foundation, and also because of where the field is, as we've been talking, some of this conceptual stuff is really foundational to moving the field forward. So we need both, and encourage and want both. And I would also say that we are completely happy to talk through ideas and answer questions. We're very small. I was going to say we're relatively small. We're tiny. So it's very easy to answer questions and talk with people ahead of time. And everybody says this, but it's really true. We really do want to fund projects. And I think it's very uncommon so far that we haven't funded things, in part because we've talked with people a little bit ahead of time, made sure things were connected, and either discouraged or encouraged people to apply if they fit in within our mission or within our goals. So we really do encourage it. I will also say, because this is a cooperative agreement with NIH, NIH actually does have a role in evaluating our awards. So sticking to our mission, our goals is important because this is cooperative with NIH and they have their goals. And so we're working together. So we are very tiny, but there is an NIH role that we do integrate into whatever we do. So I want to just show what we've awarded so far, just to give a sense of the scope of what is here. And then with 2 minutes left, I was hoping Hadley could, if you don't mind being squished to the end, give us the 60-second elevator speech of what your project about. So Hadley's is the second award here as a research scholar focusing on a scoping review of the literature. And you will note that 2 of the awards that we've made so far are for scoping reviews, and the other 2 are for, actually one is using, well, you can see what they are, the 3 there. Hadley, can I put you on the spot to tell us what you're doing?
So I am very fortunate to be mentored by Janelle Hamner at Pitt for this project. We are conducting a scoping review of health-related quality of life and family well-being for pediatric genetic conditions. So we're looking specifically at HRQOL for the children, and kind of cataloging the measures and the conditions that HRQOL has been studied in. And then we're also thinking about kind of family well-being more broadly. So that piece is a little bit more conceptual, thinking about how scholars have thought about well-being, what frameworks they have used and what measures they have used to describe family well-being in the context of genetic conditions.
And one of the ways that I can highlight how the network kind of interfaces with our scholars, in addition to the mentoring, is this scoping review will identify instruments and concepts that then will become part of our research resource repository. So there is this interrelationship between our grantees, not just for us to be able to give them visibility and to highlight work through our resources, but also directly contributes to what we then have available for others working in the field as time goes on. So we're looking forward to putting that into our repository of resources going forward. Thank you, Hadley. We have a couple minutes left if there's any questions or comments.
Would you be interested in work that potentially does work with immigrant communities to think about alternative definitions of the family, particularly in, you know, non-Western groups?
Yes, in fact, somebody is working on a project right now to kind of bring us back to some of those foundational issues of what family means in different kind of contexts across ages. So that would be highly relevant. In fact, that was part of our intention originally, to encourage projects on those 2 things, both what is the definition of family and what construct are we talking about in terms of well-being. And we would definitely encourage that and be interested in it.
Eve, I think I mentioned to you that I was doing some work on the impact of grief on families. So when a child dies, the impact that it has on the family with grief. Would that be of interest, in different applications to think about that? I know we've talked about it before, like, does that count for spillover effect and an economic evaluation and other applications with that? But just curious, kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so absolutely, it affects well-being. I think the one thing would be important is to integrate the measurement aspect somehow.
Right. Yeah, that's actually the tricky part. And I think that's the interesting piece, right? Because you look at like an EQ5D or an SF60, and, at least now there's this new, the EQ HWB or well-being or whatever that is.
Yeah, that thing. I know.
Yeah, John Brazier's. But that's actually the interesting piece, is do you really capture grief when you're measuring it on a utility scale? And there's probably a lot of work that could be done to show that the parts you are and the parts that you're not, right, of really measuring that.
Yeah, and so I could see it in that, and I could see that in that direction.
The methodological piece.
Right,
Yeah.
so like what exists that either is getting that or is not getting that, which would therefore inform.
Right, like what are the right instruments to use when you want to really get it, or what are the best ones to use? That's part of it too. It's like none of them are going to be perfect, but some might be better than others, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think what that points to a little bit is these are small projects. These are year-long projects. So the goal is to get a little discrete nugget that is one little bit that will move some aspect of this field forward, and do that, and then move on. And people can award. You can get awards in more than 1 year. That's what I'm trying to say. I can't figure out how to say it. Not more than one in 1 year, but so in other words, a project that is for 1 year that might be funded could lead to a project in the next year and one could apply for like the next stage of it in a subsequent year. So they're small chunks.
Other quick question is, can the scholar and pilot things be combined? So if you work with a postdoc, could you do like 16,000 as a combined thing? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's one way to think about trying to increase funding a little bit.
Yeah. That was one of the things we added just recently, because some projects are bigger in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they're not up there. I can't remember. Yes, they were up there. Yeah. Two of our most recent awards were dual scholar and pilot.
Okay.
So they have both elements of the mentoring part with just a flat stipend, and then the actual project with the typical costs associated with some sort of small project. I think we're at time. I don't want to go over.
We always go over time. If you can hang around, we
I'm fine.
More questions.
No, I just try to be good.
People will drop off, but I know some people will hang around.
Okay.
Eve, your presentation, and particularly Tara's question, introduced something that I thought about a long time ago when I read a paper by Bernie O'Brien about altruism when estimating willingness to pay. Here is, what about the potential implications? Let's say that we can measure these family effects. Does that mean that potentially, when you compare a child in a large family versus an orphan, that you've got to save the child in the large family over the orphan because of the spillover effects? I'm not sure if that came up in some of the discussions that when you did the special edition, or have you had some thoughts about if we do measure this successfully, what does it mean for resource allocation and the justice principle particularly?
Yeah, that is that guy's argument. What's his name? Sorry. So Brower wrote there was like counterpoint with Werner Brauer and Chris McCabe. Among his arguments, sort of arguing against incorporation of spillover effects. It depends on number one, whether you weight people, and number two, on whether you really just sort of sum up everybody together. And so that's where so no, I don't believe we ought to. I mean, personally, I don't believe we ought to weight that spillover should imply that people with a lot of people around them have more value than people with fewer people around them, that they are not inherently more valuable because they impact other people. Although I do understand that argument, and I do think it has some merit. I think that if we were going to combine individual measures and sort of use spillover in that way, then there would have to be some discounting for the size of the family. But it also, I think, argues for a family-specific metric that is not a combination of individuals, because a combination of individuals really buys into this idea of one person and spillover on all the surrounding people. A family metric is really a different animal, and it is a thing that exists, whether it be 2 people or 8 people. And it shouldn't really be bigger by virtue of being 8 people than 2. I mean, it should not be a function. I don't think it necessarily has to be a function of the number of individuals that contribute to that metric.
Oh, no, I believe in the counter argument is this argument of why are airplanes so much safer than cars, and that's because the spillover effect of an airplane accident, or what did we all feel during 9/11? So I'm not saying that these things aren't real, and maybe can explain some things, and maybe can be utilized to mobilize things like the work that St. Jude's does and other things like that. It is a real phenomena, and there's ways to kind of overcome some of this and to utilize it. But there is some questions about its potential implications.
I think there are, and I think there are reasonable people who can argue both sides of sort of equity and distribution, aside completely from math and measurement.
Are there any other questions?
I had a question, and I apologize, my connection isn't great, so if you can't hear me, let me know. I actually got kicked off for a couple minutes. But this concept of kind of a community of disease is something that's very prevalent in veterans healthcare research right now. So much so that PCOR and SIR work is starting to expand out beyond the individual veteran to the veteran's family and community. Is that something that might be interested for your organization? Work in that area?
I will admit my ignorance in that I don't really know what you're talking about. I understand the words, but it's not something I'm familiar with. So I can't answer your question. Can you tell me a little bit more when you mean a community of disease?
Sure. So a lot of the injuries or illness that we see in our veterans population spill over into their family units or their communities. Oftentimes, caregivers for veterans are somebody who live with them, especially when it's a debilitating disability, such as a lot of the mental health that veterans suffer can have a negative effect on development and opportunities for their children, their spouses, things like that. So we're starting to look more in patient preferences for comparative research or comparative treatments beyond just the veterans themselves, but also into their families, their communities, and people who have direct stakeholders in their lives.
Yeah, so I would my vocabulary for that would be the spillover that we're talking about, I think. And actually, and we did have a paper on this. I thought there was there's a data set, and there have been analyses that I have seen looking at exactly this issue, because it's kind of obvious among veterans, right? Because the relatively young age, and the intact families, and also the ability to capture those outcomes, because people are within oftentimes a closed insurance system. So in a way, kind of easy to measure there. So yes, absolutely, it would be something of interest, as with any other families.
Thank you.
Am I missing something?
No, I don't believe so.
Dave, I thought you were going to ask whether they could fund a zebrafish study.
It's mosquito fish, but
Oh, okay.
I'll work my way there.
I think one of the interesting things, so I don't know much about veterans healthcare or even the VA system or anything, because there's sort of this line in funding and all that kind of thing. But I think one of the interesting things that I can think of would be opportunities for measurement in different, this is just where my mind is going, in different sorts of essentially data systems, where different sorts of outcomes are captured that would allow you to look at family level outcomes that might not be available in, outside of the VA system. I have no idea if that's the direction you were going in. It's just something that came to my mind.
It is one direction I've been going in. And that data is available within the VA system. It's actually packaged up quite nicely if you have access to it.
Yeah, which is a huge opportunity for research that for those who have access to it is really an opportunity. And that's what I meant. There's kind of like this line, there's those who have access and those who don't. But for those who do, it's probably undermined, at least in this field, to my knowledge.
Well, John, maybe that's something you and I could discuss later.
Yep. Okay, Eve, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I hope that you come back again, and that we get to see some of the results of the work that you've been doing. And you're welcome to be part of the group and stay on our email list, because I think that there's certainly some presentations that are within your bailiwick. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for everyone who was participating. And do we have someone for next week?
Yeah, we have Lind up for next week.
Great.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yikes, it's me.
Yeah, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me come. And I really am serious about any interest, like offline interest in anything that we're doing. I really do encourage, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody. And I really apologize for the dog interruption. I thought I had it under control. It was not. Slightly.
We always have dog interruptions.
That was a really bad one for me. That. Anyway,
our T-Rex is often barging in, so it's.
We're going to have a conversation after this once I'm off camera. Anyway, thank you all. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.